Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Burisma?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to The Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The co-host is always Eric Eggers. You will notice his book in the bookshelf because that's going to be the subject of conversation today. Not the book per se, but the subject matter, because there's a fascinating new study out that actually, I think, quite legitimately quantifies how many illegals that they expect to vote in the upcoming 2024 election. It's actually based on academic research.
I'd like to take a moment just talk about how the tables have turned, so to speak. But actually, nothing's changed except for the book's been swapped out in the background. But that's because for once, we're talking about a book I wrote, not a book you wrote, although it's fair to say that the sales of said book, that came out 6 years ago, are a small economy of scale compared to yours. But no, it is fun to see it be in the news. And it's funny to talk about like illegal voting and how a lot of the topics from that book have resurfaced and seem to be very relevant in 2024, and how very sensitive still some words are as it relates to how you talk about this. And I think there's one thing that I'm proud of about that book and the research we do here at the Government Accountability Institute, because of the lead you set and the example that you make sure we all follow, is that we talk about things in a factual manner and in a responsible manner. And so I was doing a TV interview last week, and I was like, hey, by the way, I wrote a book called Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. And they go, yeah, maybe don't say the F word, please, on TV, because there's lawsuits and things.
Yeah, there is.
You understand. But what we're about to talk about today is not a conspiracy. This is data. And this is, hey, here's a bunch of different sort of factors that are moving towards the same way. And could it matter in 2024 in the fall? Because I think the answer is yes, it could.
Absolutely. And let's talk about the data, specifically the source of it.
Yep.
Okay, this is not some crackpot group. This is not some, weird online thing. This is actually some scholars that took data from something called the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies. And these are based on massive surveys that are done on people that voted during elections. In 2010, for example, they've polled 55,400 people. And what this data shows is they ask them a series of questions. They ask them questions like, are you a U.S. citizen? Yes or no? Did you vote in the election? And what this survey found out, I think quite stunning, is that 10 to 27% of those people who say that they are not U.S. citizens in the United States are actually registered to vote. And about 5 to 13% of them actually have voted in presidential elections. Now, what does that translate into real numbers? If you look at the number of migrants in the United States today, legally and illegally, so these are people that are here maybe on a green card or a temporary visa, or people that snuck across the border, what that means is with 20 million non-citizen adults living in the United States, that translates to 1 million to 2.7 million who, if the pattern holds, will vote illegally in 2024, which is a absolutely stunning number.
Well, think about this. If the statistics hold, by all accounts, they say something like 16 million more illegal immigrants have entered this country in the last 3 years because of the Biden border policies. So if you just take 10%, it's a very easy fraction to calculate. 10% of 16 million would be 1.6. So, these are real things. And so when you consider, and there's all kinds of pushback about, well, why would a legal immigrant think that they could vote? There's no reason to do so. There's lots of different arguments about the things that exist to keep them from voting. In my research that I conducted for my book and in subsequent research, the fact remains that there's very few incentives against voting. Like there's very few safeguards that we should say that keep people from being registered to vote. And this gets back to this whole laundry list of, motor voter law. And so automatic registration when you go to get a driver's license, and then states don't cross-reference them. There's been tens of thousands of people in California, for example, that were, unwittingly registered to vote when they went to go get their driver's license. And so, you add it all up and you combine that with this push by the Biden administration to, in an unprecedented way, leverage the mechanism of the federal government to basically be a taxpayer-funded get-out-the-vote operation. And you've got more people than ever who shouldn't be voting but are here. Maybe it's unclear. And I think it's fair to say, it's possibly going to be a relevant factor in the 2024 election.
Well, and let's look at that. So, for example, again, looking at this data, this is highly respected data. 55,000 people respond to these surveys. These are people that voted. They asked them a series of questions. Here is what the other data shows with regards to these surveys. In 2008 and the 2010 elections, those who said that they were not citizens but were registered to vote and actually voted, 67% of them voted for Barack Obama in 2008. Only 1/3 of them voted for the Republican candidate, John McCain. And when it came to the 2010 midterm elections, now remember, those are ones where the Republicans retook the House, sort of the reaction against Barack Obama. In 2010, this same category of people, 53% voted for Democrat House candidates. Only 30% indicated that they voted for Republicans. Again, this is those voters themselves describing what their status is and who they actually voted for. And as their analysis shows, it made a huge difference just by looking at the data. For example, Al Franken, he won by 312 votes in 2008 in Minnesota. Just looking at the number of migrants in that state, he would not have won that seat were it not for this vote. So the premise of this research shows that this can actually tilt elections. But Eric, what we are assured by our government is that, don't worry, we actually check this stuff, right? That if somebody goes in Texas or California, gets a driver's license, and they're automatically registered to vote, don't worry, because local authorities will check that. And if they're not eligible to vote, they won't be registered to vote and they won't be able to vote. Is that true?
It's not true. And no less than the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, said recently that it's not true. He's talked about the fact that currently, and this, it's interesting because even last week, Catherine Engelbrecht with True the Vote, we've had her on the podcast before. She did an interview with Tucker Carlson. She talked about 18 U.S. Code 611, in which, subsection 3 suggests that maybe it's not the illegal alien won't be punished for voting if they reasonably believe at the time of voting in the violation of subsection that they were a citizen. So she's calling into question the mentality and the mindset. Maybe there's a possibility if you truly believe you're a citizen, then you can't be punished.
How do you truly believe you're a citizen and not be a citizen? I mean, wouldn't you know?
I don't know. You got people identifying as furries in middle school. So is it not possible? Somebody could think
they identify as a voter, as a citizen.
But
right?
the point is the bias. It's all about incentive structures. The bias for the voter registration mechanism is not to verify citizenship.
Correct.
And so there's been this argument about if you don't check the citizenship box, should you infer that as they are a citizen, as they not? And this is something that lawyers fight over, and it depends on if it's a red state or a blue state. But what Mike Johnson said recently is there's no way for states to ask someone if they check the box and say, I'm a citizen, when they do the motor voter registration. That's true. And not only is there no way to do it, they're prevented by law from asking. Like the DMV person is not allowed to say, are you actually a citizen?
Well, even that, I kind of assumed that, the local head of elections gets this from the DMV, and they check some federal database. There is no federal database. They don't check anything. The federal government doesn't provide anything for these local authorities. So there's no way for them to check other than the word of the person who is getting the driver's license. So it's madness. There is absolutely no mechanism to actually guard against this, which is stunning to me.
One way to look is to see if non-citizens self-report and take themselves off of jury pool registrations.
Right.
And some Leon County, and let's say Leon County, we're in Leon County, and I used to speak to the person that's the supervisor of election here. There are county elections officials who do a due diligence, and they do cross-reference it with these databases. So there are some mechanisms, but you have to be proactive about it.
Right.
And so some people are, and some people try to do a good job of pruning the data rules, but they're often fought at every turn by people that are lawyers who try to keep them as error-ridden as possible. One of the things that we talked about in my book and in subsequent other election integrity mechanisms is the Supreme Court statistics. Like 12 million voter registration rolls in this country are wrong. They were, as of 2012, I think it's like 1 out of 8 voter registrations. So we know there's problems, and whenever states try to validate them or verify them, they're prevented from doing so by these lawyers who tend to be funded, by the way, by the same people who then fund the groups that go out and exploit the voter registration errors.
So I want you to unpack for us why that's a problem, because somebody might say, well, so who cares if the voter rolls are inaccurate, if somebody's registered to vote? If that person doesn't show up and vote, why should I care? So what's the concern and the harm if you got voter rolls that are inaccurate? You've got people who are dead. You've got people in their duplicate. You've got, people at different addresses and different dates. Why does it actually matter in terms of the vote?
Voter registration rolls are easily exploited if people know and want to take advantage of those errors. There was actually a thing that happened. It's like one of my favorite stories from the book, that in New York City, a bunch of undercover agents went around in New York and they had identified people they knew shouldn't have been on the voter rolls.
Yep.
And so they sent undercover agents to try to vote on behalf of, I think it's like the 63 erroneous registrations they'd identified just in New York City. Of the 63 that they tried to cast ballots on, they were successful 61 times. 61 every time. And one of the only times they couldn't do it, they were trying to cast the ballot on behalf of a felon, and the guy was prevented from casting his ballot because the felon's mom was actually working the polling place. They're like, bro, that's my son. You cannot cast that ballot. It's true. And the federal election was like, okay, you got me on that one. Right. But so they take advantage of them. And again, this gets back to like the Biden administration's asking federal agencies to go out and register new voters.
Right.
And the incentives now is like, how many did you register? Not how many valid people did you register. And then that's going to turn into how many people did you get to go vote.
Right.
So the bias is always about like volume, not accuracy. And so then this gets to be a real troubling issue when like there's a messaging issue, and are we allowed to vote? Are we not allowed to vote? And I didn't know this. The guy that used to be the head of the Democratic National Committee, Tom Perez, he came from the Obama Department of Justice under Eric Holder in the Civil Rights Division. And his bias has always been expanding non-citizen voting rights. He worked for a group that was also source funded back in 2002 called Casa de Maryland. They're like an Acorn type group. Their whole gig was getting non-citizen voting access improved. And so that's actually one of the reasons why non-citizen voting is as prevalent as it is in the United States today. There's 15 cities that let illegal immigrants vote in different local elections. 11 of them happen to be located in Maryland because of the work of this group, Casa de Maryland, and Tom Perez, who, by the way, now is a senior advisor to Joe Biden in intergovernmental affairs.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So the concern is that you have these voter rolls that are inaccurate. You've got people listed that shouldn't be listed, and people are actually voting. And I imagine that's, in the case you just cited, people showed up at the polls and tried to vote. The bigger concern, of course, is if you're doing mail-in ballots. In other words, if you're sending out, okay, we're going to send out ballots to every registered voter, which is what they did in 2020 because of COVID.
And they'll probably do in 2024 because they did it in 2020.
Yeah, and now, you saw these reports in Las Vegas, some guy in an apartment, like 11 ballots with different names showed up at his address because they were never cleaned up. Somebody could fill those out en masse and probably is filling them out en masse. That's the concern about the voter ballots.
Yeah, and I think, is it possible that that COVID, we talked about the way that COVID changed society, right?
Yeah.
And actually, I think we're experiencing here locally the same general trend that may be true largely as a society. We got schools are closed in Tallahassee where we are today because there's some tornadoes that came through and there's some devastation that's occurred, and it's a real thing. Some people are having a lot of property destroyed. But what we've seen, and we talked to somebody with the Moms for Liberty people about, the shift seems to be the bias is now for schools. If it's close, they're going to close, right? Because that's what we do now. And I'm just wondering, we did that because of COVID. I'm just wondering, do we now, hey, if it's close, let's just mail everybody a ballot because that's what we do now. That's the precedent we've established. And if that's one of the legacies of COVID, then our democracy is not stronger as a result of it. It's like, no, because of the Zuckbucks thing, it's okay for us to just go out and we're going to do whatever we can to find people. It's one of the reasons why, the House just issued these subpoenas for members of the Small Business Administration. They didn't show up to testify, even though the House Committee on Small Business is like, wait, what are you guys doing? Why are you taking taxpayer dollars? And with this first of its kind partnership with the state of Michigan small business groups, you guys are out there trying to improve voter turnout. You're using tax dollars to do it. Michigan has like the 8th highest voter turnout in the country.
So what was the money supposedly going for? Like the Small Business Administration was partnering with small businesses in Michigan.
Yeah, just to give them voter registration information. They're creating a website. It's basically like, hey, we're going to go into each and every small business and we're going to give you access to information, and we're trying to encourage you in a proactive front foot manner to register more people to vote, which is not necessarily a function of small businesses per se, but it's still the Biden administration is targeting voters in key demographics. In this case, they're targeting voters in Michigan because it's an important swing state. Yeah. Whereas the state that actually has the lowest voter turnout, Texas, is not. Right. And they do not have a Biden partnership as a result.
They want higher voter turnout in certain states.
Yeah.
And you see the same pattern, by the way, with a lot of the money that's being sent out to encourage highway construction in Pennsylvania, for example. Huge amounts of money going there. It's a swing state. You have the deal up in Wisconsin where they announced the new factory in Wisconsin with federal tax incentives. That was in the state of Wisconsin, which is, of course, a swing state. They're doing the same thing you're saying with the voter registration. Even if these states have high levels of voter turnout, they're targeting states that will help Joe Biden try to win in 2024.
So all I'm saying is we got the Biden administration targeting key demographics that they know will be beneficial politically. You've got an unprecedented new number of possible voters because they're legal immigrants entering this country, and you've got conditions under which it's not very easy to keep them from voting, right? Or it's actually quite challenging to keep them from voting because of the inherent bias. And I just think it's going to be a mixture of things that make a questionable environment for election integrity in 2024.
So we've got the study we talked about that estimates, again, based on the responses that people have given to these comprehensive surveys, that between 1 million and 2.7 million people will illegally vote in this election. That's a huge number because we're basically looking at a handful of states, right? 5 states, 6 swing states. They're going to determine the election. So,
and by the way, there's states that the Bidens are losing in right now.
Yeah. And if you look at what those states are, Arizona, for example, got a huge influx of illegals, right? Michigan, certainly you've seen a lot of there. Pennsylvania. These are states that either have agricultural or industrial economies that want the labor force, so people are going to tend to gravitate there. These individuals are going to be registered to vote, and if you don't have some kind of monitoring, this is the way you could potentially swing an election.
Yeah, and I think so whether they're illegal voters or just new voters, that the Biden weaponization of the federal agency stuff. Remember, we had that one stat that showed that going after people. I mean, think about this. Federal dollars are going to housing developments,
right?
Welfare
recipients,
public housing, welfare recipients, college campuses, and the one estimate said that they could swing voting turnout for Joe Biden by like up to 30% among welfare recipients, just because they're leveraging the Department of Agriculture and making them into a voter registration machine. Yeah. So it's like everything they can do, they are doing. Yeah. And the taxpayers are paying for it.
It makes me wonder, there was a news report, I think it was in the New York Times, about how Joe Biden is like very confident. His aides are all concerned. They're looking at the polls. Mm-hmm. They're all nervous. And Joe Biden's like, it's going to be fine. I'm going to win. It could be all the issues related to age. It could be hubris. It could also be that he has confidence in this plan, this registering to vote, the fact that there aren't constraints on illegals. It could be that he has some confidence that the polls don't really matter. It's ultimately about who turns out to vote. And if you've got a lot of people who are recently registered to vote, those are probably not going to be people that are going to be polled as aggressively as people that are longtime voters.
No, I totally agree. I think the conditions seem actually quite favorable for Joe Biden between the influx of illegals. You got the Tom Perez thing. We got the background. You got the mail-in balloting expansion. So if I were them, I would be quite confident because, And by the way, when you reference these stats, the stats that you just talked about, 1 to 2 million people are voting in the election, that will be dismissed as a conspiracy. So It's not like there's an appetite to have an honest evaluation or assessment of like, hey, how real is this? Even though people have taken this data, I mean, Donald Trump talked about this. And he's like, oh, that's ridiculous. Their mechanisms are not good. Just this week, it was validated by a third party. Said, actually, we took a look at this. We took a look at the pushback, and here are our findings on it. To build on it in a more credible way. Mike Johnson taking it seriously, and so they're going to try to make it so that the Democrats pass a bill that is related to border security, which, by the way, the Democrats seem willing to pass a bill on border security because it is a political liability, but they want to put in that codifying the fact that it is illegal for illegal immigrants to vote in federal elections, even though there's been stats that show more than half of Democrats think illegals should be able to vote in federal elections. So it's a very relevant thing for the election. Yeah.
Well, to me, the most compelling thing is this data where you're actually asking people who voted in elections, are you a U.S. citizen? Did you vote? Who did you vote for? And people are answering it honestly. That to me is the most compelling evidence of anything. And you can't dismiss that as a conspiracy theory. So we're also about solutions. Give me, say, 3 of what you think would be the most important reforms that we can make. Obviously, we're not going to have a perfect system. We want to have a system where people can access voting, but you have to have constraints on it. So give me 3 that you think would help deal with this problem specifically.
Well, Peter, it's like I always like to say, there's not a lot of money in the solutions business. So I generally steer clear of solving the problem. No, but
is this why you run your household as well, by the way?
100%. It's all chaos. It's all chaos. I think my wife finds it quite helpful. And I'm like, that seems to be a problem. We should do something about that. But I think that we need to have more, like the fact that there isn't some database that all the states give their data to and it all just gets cross-referenced and then spit back, like that's insane. And it almost seems like intentional.
Yeah, and you mentioned something to me earlier when we were talking about this subject. There's a data set or a data, ERIC it's called.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are 2 different.
Named it after you, I'm sure.
There are 2 different data sets that states could combine. They give their data in there, and they get some, they get the validation.
But some people have stepped away from that. Why?
Because they feel like the information wasn't being utilized. It's Soros funded, and they get the DMV information, but it's not being cross-referenced with the citizenship stuff. And they say that actually the information goes to political entities they can use for get out the vote effort. So 9 states have left ERIC for that reason. So I think that there should just be more sharing, and I just think it should be acceptable to be able to say, hey, look, we're going to value integrity and accuracy as much as we're going to value access.
Yeah, and why can't you have citizenship data available to local election authorities to actually confirm whether somebody's a citizen?
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
And actually, illegal immigration attorneys will tell you that the lack of verification and the ease in which illegal immigrants can be registered to vote and actually vote is a problem, because when you're trying to become a citizen, being registered to vote is a real problem. Being registered to vote alone may be enough to keep you from becoming eligible for citizenship. And if you actually vote, legal immigration attorneys will tell you that's a capital offense. People unwittingly are deported because they voted on accident.
A capital offense?
Mm-hmm. Well, a capital offense from an immigration standpoint.
Okay.
No, not like
say they're not executing people who are voting illegal. Right?
Not in this country.
Yeah, so that seems to me information sharing and having access to that information, I think is super important. Anything else that can be done? We talk to people all the time who see it's impossible to get things done in Washington. What's something that you think could be done at the local level or could be encouraged? Can people actually look at voter rolls themselves? I mean, I know there are some efforts to audit at the state and local level. Is that something that you think could be helpful?
Yeah, people can access voter rolls because that's how you get, if you're a political candidate, you figure out who your voters are going to be and you can purchase them or you have access to them. Remember, that's actually the book that we did. We did because we gained access to, I think it was 32 states worth of voter roll information.
I remember, yeah.
And we found tens of thousands of duplicate voting. So, this was the first thing that said, hey, these elections systems aren't that secure. We found over 2,000 people that cast 2 ballots in the state of Florida in the 2016 election. They cast 1 ballot in the state of Florida and cast a second ballot in a different state. And so it's just a mentality thing, because when we got in touch with some of those people and said, hey, how come you've moved, but you didn't tell these other states that you've left, so you're still registered to vote in more than one state? And the people are like, well, I didn't think it was any of their business. So it just shows you how reliant on self-reporting the systems are. So it's weird because the decentralized nature of it is actually one of the best mechanisms for
Yep.
security we have, right? So
Yep.
no one can like hack a federal election.
Right.
But at the same time, that decentralization keeps coordination and communication from happening, which leads to the inaccuracy that then can be exploited by bad actors.
Yeah, and especially in this era, we have close elections. Presidential elections settled by tens of thousands of votes out of the vast number that are cast. You have local congressional elections, sometimes settled by a couple hundred votes. We can't just rely on self-reporting, and we can't rely on, ultimately, right now the system relies on the DMV to essentially vet people. If they can get a driver's license, then they're eligible to vote, is just shocking and needs to be dealt with.
And this is maybe, by the way, one of the more insidious things about the January 6th deal.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if you see the movie Netflix, in Unfrost on Netflix, there's a very clever take on the January 6th situation. But January 6th, people want to say is like, oh, this just shows you the lengths that people will go to subvert and undermine democracy.
Yeah.
And so that it's added like a property destruction, violent angle to having a conversation about the validity of U.S. elections. So now it's like even just having this conversation, people will become afraid because now it's like, oh, am I going to be seen as a traitor?
Right.
When in fact, I would say it's actually one of the more patriotic things you can do to have a conversation about
Absolutely.
how to make American elections as safe and like reliable so
Yeah.
that no matter who wins, everyone sort of has confidence about the accuracy of the outcome.
Yeah, and part of that, of course, is done by design because this is a conversation that a lot of them don't actually want to have for a variety of reasons. Well, we appreciate your expertise, Eric. I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book. It came out in 2018, and it talked about how the left plans to steal the next election. So it was certainly prophetic in terms of the issues that arose, and it's still a book that's very, very relevant today.
And we've been talking about election integrity for 6 years, and ain't nobody come at us yet.
That's exactly right. Well, we appreciate you, as always, taking the time to listen to this podcast. We know your time is valuable. You can find out more about our research at thedrilldown.com. You can pick up the book Fraud at Amazon or other bookstores. And you can, of course, find this podcast wherever fine podcasts are broadcast. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.